The rain had been falling for hours, the kind of steady silver rain that seemed less like weather and more like music. It tapped against the windows in a rhythm older than words, a lullaby offered by the sky. In the quiet of the room, the sound became a blanket soft, unending, a comfort that wrapped itself around every thought and every breath. A lamp glowed low on the table, its light golden and tired, like a flame that wanted to rest as much as the listener did. Shadows stretched gently across the walls, not sharp, but soft, round, and calm. Outside, the world was washed in gray-blue, blurred by mist and rain. Inside, everything was still. It was on a night like this, long ago, that someone first dreamed of something impossible. A ship not on the sea, but in the sky. A vessel that would float above the world, vast and silent, moving not through water, but through clouds. To some, it was a fantasy. To others, it was madness. But to a few hearts restless, curious, and endlessly patient, it was destiny, close. Your eyes for a moment, and imagine the rain falling over old European fields more than 100 years ago. Imagine dark forests stretching to the horizon, rivers glistening under stormy skies, and villages where candlelight flickered in every window. The world felt heavy with earth, grounded and certain, yet, above it all, the clouds drifted, mysterious, unreachable. To touch them, to move through them, to live among them, that was the dream. For centuries, humans had watched birds, their wings carrying them effortlessly into the sky. Children pointed upward, following the shapes of geese migrating south. Farmers paused in their fields, gazing at hawks circling high, higher still. And always, the same thought whispered in their hearts. What if we could go to the first attempts had been balloons, fragile envelopes of silk, heated air lifting them like lanterns into the wind. They floated, yes, but they were at the mercy of the sky. They went where the wind pushed, unable to choose their path. Dreamers celebrated, but they wanted more. They wanted not just to drift, but to travel, not just to float, but to steer, to build a ship, one that would belong to the sky the way a vessel belongs to the sea. And so, on a rainy night in the late 1800s, in the mind of a man who could not let go of that childhood dream, the first vision of a Zeppelin began to take shape. His name would become history. His invention would be remembered in awe, in wonder, and in whispers. But tonight, in this story, he is not yet a legend. He is only a dreamer, awake in the soft glow of candlelight, listening to the rain and imagining the impossible. The rain fell harder for a moment, then softened again, as though the sky itself leaned in to listen. The room where he sat was small, filled with paper, pens, and silent determination. Each drop of rain seemed to echo his thoughts, patient, steady, unending. And just as rain falls one drop at a time, so too would his dream be built, not all at once, but slowly, carefully, piece by piece, until at last the sky itself would hold it. Tonight, you do not need to rush. Like him, you are safe here, in the shelter of rain, in the calm of the night. His story is just beginning, and your dreams are waiting, soft and endless. Breathe with the rain. Let the world outside fade. This is how the story of the Zeppelin begins. The rain outside whispered on, steady as breath. It had been falling for so long now that it seemed eternal, as though the world itself had always been washed in this silver lullaby. Inside, The room remained quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp, and the story drifted deeper, back in time, back before the dream of a Zeppelin, back to when humanity first touched the sky, long before anyone spoke the word airship, long before engineers thought of metal frames and gas cells. There were balloons, simple, delicate, wondrous balloons. They were born of fire, fabric, and the restless human desire to rise. Imagine, if you will, a small French village in 1783. The Montgolfier brothers, two papermakers by trades, stood before a curious crowd. They had stitched together cloth, sealed it with paper and varnish, and beneath it they lit a fire. Slowly, impossibly, the great fabric envelope filled with heated air, trembling like a giant heart. The villagers gasped. Children clutched their parents' hands. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then silently, softly it lifted. The balloon rose above the rooftops, above the fields, above the astonished faces turned skyward. For the first time in history, humans had built something that carried itself into the sky. It did not flap wings. It did not mimic birds. It simply floated, like a lantern released into the night. The rain against the window deepened, as if applauding that moment. Soon, balloons were carrying not just air, but life. A sheep, a duck, and a rooster were among the first passengers, gently carried upward, their little hearts pounding as they saw the earth shrink beneath them. Not long after, humans followed, brave men in wigs and coats, stepping into wicker baskets tied beneath the silk. They rose higher and higher, the wind tugging them, the earth falling away. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was freedom. But there was a problem. The balloons could rise, but they could not steer. They drifted helplessly, slaves to the wind. A journey might begin in one village and end in a forest, a lake, or even the sea. For all their beauty, balloons were more like clouds than ships. They moved, yes, but they were not masters of their path. Still, the dream grew. In Germany, France, and England, inventors whispered to one another in candlelit workshops. If balloons could float, could they not also be guided? Could a sail, a paddle, or even an engine be added to the floating envelope, turning, drifting into travel? The thought stayed alive, glowing quietly through decades of attempts. At the same time, others looked not to balloons, but to wings. Men like Otto Lilienthal, in the late 1800s, built gliders that leaped into the wind. On grassy hills, he spread his strange contraptions, wide frames of wood and fabric that caught the air. He leaped, and for a moment he flew. Not far, not high, but far enough to awaken imagination. Watching him, people began to believe that humans could do more than dream of the sky, they could live in it. The rain outside softened, as if listening, so the stage was set. Balloons had taught humanity how to rise. Gliders had shown how to float and steer. And still, the longing remained for something greater, a ship in the sky, strong as a vessel at sea, yet lighter than air. And somewhere, in the heart of a boy named Ferdinand von Zeppelin, that longing began to settle like a seed waiting for rain. He watched the balloons with awe, studied the gliders with fascination, and whispered to himself, there must be a way to build a true ship of the clouds. The rain sighed gently, steady and patient, as though it already knew what was to come. The rain outside continued its endless song, steady and soft, as if the sky itself was breathing. In its rhythm, we drift backward once more, into the mid-1800s, when a boy named Ferdinand von Zeppelin first opened his eyes to the wide world above. He was born in the summer of 1838 in Constance, a town resting peacefully along the lake that bore the same name, like Constance, its waters vast and silver, stretching like a mirror beneath the Bavarian sky. The boy grew up with the smell of damp earth after rain, the sound of water lapping against stone, and above all, the wide canopy of clouds drifting lazily over the Alps. For a child, the sky was never just sky. It was a stage for stories. He lay in the grass on long afternoons, watching the way clouds changed shape, how they stretched into castles and ships, into dragons and mountains. He pointed upward, laughing, seeing things no adult bothered to see. His heart belonged not to the ground, but to the heavens. On summer mornings, hot air balloons sometimes appeared at fairs in nearby towns. They were fragile things of silk and fire, yet, to a boy's eyes, they were miracles. Ferdinand would tug on his father's coat, begging to be taken closer. He would stand among the crowd, small and wide-eyed, watching as the flame roared beneath the balloon, filling it with breath. The silk would shiver, swell, and then lift. The crowd would gasp, hands clapping, hats raised in salute. But young Ferdinand was silent, his breath caught. He wasn't marveling at the sight of the balloon rising. He was imagining himself inside it, sailing above the trees, above the rooftops, across the lake, into the sky where no roads or borders could stop him. That night, when rain tapped against the shutters of his bedroom, he whispered to himself, "One day I will fly." The rain outside the present moment deepened, as though agreeing. As Ferdinand grew older, the world pressed in with lessons, books, duties. He was sent to schools where discipline was strict, where the future was shaped for men of his class: military service, responsibility, order. But no matter how heavy the lessons, his mind wandered back to the sky. His notebooks, meant for arithmetic and German composition, sometimes held doodles of long floating shapes, like boats, except they hovered among clouds. When he was still a teenager, he read about the Montgolfier brothers, about the first flights in France, about the strange experiments with gases lighter than air. He devoured these tales the way some boys devoured adventures of knights or explorers. His adventure, he knew, would not be on land or sea. His stage was the sky. One autumn evening, a storm rolled across Lake Constance. Thunder boomed against the mountains, and rain lashed the rooftops. Ferdinand stood at his window, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from awe. Lightning split the clouds, illuminating them like silver giants. And in that moment, he imagined a vessel, vast and shining, moving steadily through the storm, unafraid, not drifting helplessly like a balloon, but steering with purpose. Like a captain guiding a ship, the image would not leave him, even when the storm passed, even when morning sunlight returned. The picture lived inside him, a ship in the sky, a floating giant. The years went by. Ferdinand became a young man, tall and disciplined, his path leading him toward the military, toward order and service. Yet the dream never left. On nights when he lay awake, listening to rain, he still saw it, the sky, filled not with clouds alone, but with ships, vast and calm, traveling where no road could lead. And though the world around him had no name for it yet, the child inside him whispered the word that would one day define history: Zeppelin. The rain outside softened, almost as if it, too, was whispering the name. The rain outside continued its silver tapping, a lullaby against the windows, as though the sky itself was leaning close to listen. And so the story drifted forward into the years when young Ferdinand von Zeppelin began to carry his childhood dreams into manhood. By the time he was a young man, Ferdinand had entered military service. His posture grew straight, his uniform pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. The boy who once lay in fields imagining cloud ships now stood tall among soldiers, his days filled with drills, commands, and the strict rhythms of discipline. Yet even here, in the order of marching feet and the echo of bugles, the dream of the sky remained with him. He kept his notebooks close, filled with neat handwriting, sketches, and numbers that blurred together like puzzle pieces by candlelight. In quiet barracks, when the day's duties were done, he would draw long shapes, cigar-like and elegant, hovering above mountains, outlines of frameworks, struts, and envelopes. He was no longer doodling a boy's fantasy. These were plans, early, unpolished, but real. Still, the dream needed fuel, and fate soon provided it. In 1863, Ferdinand traveled to America as an official observer during the Civil War. He had come to study military organization and modern tactics. But what caught his imagination was something else entirely: balloons. On the battlefields, the Union Army had begun to use balloons as observation posts, floating above the earth to watch enemy movements. To most, they were simply a tool, other invention of war. But to Ferdinand, seeing them rise above the smoke and chaos was like seeing a fragment of his boyhood vision come alive. He stared at the vast balloons anchored to the ground, swaying gently in the wind, and felt a surge of certainty. This is only the beginning, he thought. Back in his quarters, he wrote long notes about what he had seen. He described the balloons' fabrics, their ropes, their weaknesses. He thought about their drifting helplessness, their lack of steering. He imagined ways to change them, to give them structure, direction, control. The rain outside the story thickened, steady, and endless, as though echoing the persistence of his thoughts. Years passed. Ferdinand rose in rank, became a respected officer, a man of duty and honor. Yet at night, in quiet rooms, he was still the boy staring up at clouds, his notebooks filled with calculations. He studied mathematics, physics, and engineering, teaching himself how gases behaved, how pressure worked, how to build strength without weight. He devoured everything written about balloons and flight, from France, England, and beyond. And slowly, sketches began to take shape. No longer were his drawings vague outlines of floating shapes. Now they showed frames built from lightweight metal, a skeleton like the ribs of a whale. They showed long gas cells inside the frame, like lungs filling with breath. They showed gondolas hanging beneath, strong and steady, ready to hold engines that would finally do what no balloon had done before: steer. To Ferdinand, this was no longer a dream. It was a necessity. Humanity could not drift helplessly forever. It had to command the sky as it commanded the sea. But he also knew such a vision would not be easy. It would take money, time, and faith. He was only one man, after all, sketching by candlelight while rain whispered against the glass. The world was not yet ready to listen. Still, he believed, in those long evenings when shadows danced across his desk and the candle burned low, he would lift his eyes from the page and whisper softly to himself, "One day this ship will rise." The rain outside the present moment seemed to pause, as though holding its breath, and in that fragile silence, the story lingered between duty and dream, between the earth that held him and the sky that called to him. The blueprints were only lines on paper for now, but within them lived the first heartbeat of a Zeppelin. The rain outside did not stop. It had become a companion, steady and loyal, whispering against the window pane, as though it too wished to be part of the story. By now, Ferdinand von Zeppelin was no longer a boy sketching in the quiet corners of his notebooks, nor just a soldier passing through wars and travels. He was a man with a dream so large it filled him the way breath fills lungs. And yet, like rain searching for rivers, he knew the dream could not remain only his. It would need others, many others, for no Zeppelin could rise from the imagination of one man alone. The late 19th century was an age of invention. Railroads stitched across continents, electricity flickered into homes, and engines began to hum with a power that seemed almost alive. In such a world, it was easy for some to dismiss Ferdinand's dream as foolish. They said, "The sky is no place for ships. The sea is enough," they said. "Balloons are toys, nothing more." They said, "This is impossible." But impossible was only another kind of silence waiting to be broken. So Ferdinand, patient and unshaken, began to gather. First, he needed engineers' minds that could translate dreams into steel and canvas, mathematics into wings. He reached out quietly, meeting men in workshops where gears clicked and sparks leaped from hammers. Some shook their heads and laughed, unwilling to believe, but others listened. They leaned over his notebooks, tracing the elegant lines of his sketches, the careful numbers in the margins, the vision of a floating skeleton filled with breath. And in their eyes, Ferdinand saw the flicker of something familiar, wonder. One by one, they joined him. Not many at first, just a handful: an engineer who loved metal, a craftsman who understood fabric, a mechanic who trusted engines. Each man brought a piece of knowledge Ferdinand could not hold alone. Together, they were like musicians tuning their instruments before the first symphony. But knowledge alone was not enough. Dreams, like ships, required timber, metal, tools, and most of all, money. And here was the greatest challenge. Wealthy men laughed at the idea of investing in a ship of air. Politicians shrugged, unwilling to place trust in something that had never been seen before. More than once, doors closed in Ferdinand's face. More than once, he returned home in the rain, tired and cold, his sketches tucked under his arm, his heart heavy with rejection. But he never gave up. He spoke wherever he could: gatherings, in drawing rooms, in front of skeptical audiences. His voice was calm but full of quiet fire. He did not argue that his dream would be easy. Instead, he said what he believed with all his heart: that humanity was destined not only to walk the earth or sail the seas, but to travel the skies with strength and grace. He painted a picture of the future: vast ships moving steadily above, cities and rivers carrying people, goods, and hope. And little by little, his words reached hearts. Some listeners left unchanged, still shaking their heads. But others went home that night and found themselves unable to sleep. They imagined what it would be like to look up and see a zeppelin drifting above the clouds. They imagined stepping inside such a vessel, feeling the floor steady beneath their feet as the earth shrank below. They imagined the miracle of flight not as a momentary balloon ride, but as a true journey. And so, a few said yes, a banker, a nobleman, a friend. They opened their purses, hesitantly at first, then with growing courage. The money was never enough, never plentiful, but it was something. It was a beginning. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's small team began to gather materials. Aluminum was rare and expensive, but steel could be shaped and lightened. Wood could be bent, varnished, and reinforced. Fabric was stitched by careful hands into long sheets that would one day swell with hydrogen, their seams sealed with varnish to keep the breath inside. In quiet workshops, by candlelight and lantern glow, the sound of invention filled the air. Hammers tapped, saws whispered, needles drew long threads through fabric. Blueprints lay across tables, weighted down with tools to keep them from curling. The rain outside the story kept its rhythm, steady as the heartbeat of the dream. There were setbacks, materials cracked, calculations failed, engines sputtered and coughed. More than once, the men argued in weary voices, convinced it could not be done. Ferdinand listened, patient, his hand resting on the edge of the plans. And when silence fell, he would simply say, "We will try again." Because to him, failure was not an end. It was only another step on the path upward. And so they pressed on, word spread. Curious villagers began to whisper about the crazy Count who was building a ship for the clouds. Some mocked him, others admired him. Children, especially, ran to the workshops to peek through windows, eyes wide as they glimpsed the skeleton of something vast taking shape for what was beginning. To rise, slowly and carefully, was no longer just sketches in a notebook. It was a framework long, silver, delicate as lace, but strong as the bones of a whale. Piece by piece, rib by rib, the skeleton of the first Zeppelin began to grow. The rain against the present window hushed, as if pausing to witness it, and Ferdinand, standing within the half-built frame, looked upward, imagining it already filled with gas, already floating, already steady against the winds. His heart swelled, not with pride, but with quiet certainty. This was no longer just his dream. It had become a shared dream, carried by many hands, many minds, many hearts. A dream stitched into fabric, forged in steel, whispered into the rain, and soon, very soon, it would breathe. The rain outside had settled into a steady hush, no longer wild, no longer restless, but calm, like the soft breathing of someone on the edge of sleep. And within that quiet rhythm, the story drifted onward into the years when Ferdinand von Zeppelin's dream began to step out of imagination and into the fragile, trembling world of reality. The workshops were no longer filled only with sketches and whispered arguments. Now they held something tangible. At first, it was just pieces, rods of metal, sheets of fabric, boxes of bolts, crates of varnish. But as days folded into weeks, and weeks into months, those scattered pieces began to join. One morning mist rolled across Lake Constance, wrapping the town in a soft, gray blanket. Workers arrived at the site, their boots crunching on damp earth, their breath rising in the cold air. The structure that waited for them looked strange and fragile, like the beginnings of a cathedral built not to touch heaven, but to float within. It was the skeleton of the first Zeppelin. The frame stretched longer than any house, longer than any barn, a delicate lattice of girders and ribs. Each rib curved upward, graceful as the arc of a whale's back. Between them, struts crossed like the veins of a leaf, holding the shape steady. To the untrained eye, it looked impossibly fragile, as though a gust of wind might topple it. Yet, to those who built it, every joint, every rivet, every curve was carefully chosen, tested, and trusted. The men worked slowly, methodically. They measured twice, sometimes 3 times, before fixing a piece in place. They lifted beams together, steadying one another's hands, voices low but determined. Hammers rang softly, echoing like distant bells. Sawdust drifted to the ground. Like golden snow, the air smelled of oil, varnish, and damp earth, and always the rain whispered outside. Mingling with the rhythm of their labor, children pressed their noses against the workshop windows, wide-eyed, their voices hushed as though they were in the presence of something holy. They saw the frame rising higher and higher, its long body stretching farther with each week. To them it seemed alive already, a slumbering creature waiting for its first breath. To Ferdinand, it was even more than that. He walked among the girders, his boots echoing against the wooden planks of the scaffolding. He would place his hand on the cool metal, closing his eyes for a moment, as if listening. To him, the skeleton was not silent. It spoke. It whispered of skies yet to be crossed, of journeys not yet taken, of horizons waiting to be touched, and, though it was still only bones, still hollow and incomplete, he felt in his heart that it was already real. But progress was slow, too slow. The materials were costly, and every mistake was heavy. A cracked beam meant days lost. A failed joint meant frustration, voices rising, tempers flaring. Some workers doubted openly. "It will never fly," they muttered, shaking their heads. "It is too heavy, too strange, too much." Ferdinand listened, but he did not argue. Instead, he simply returned to the plans, the sketches that had carried him this far. With steady patience, he reminded the men, step by step, rib by rib, it will rise. And so they worked on day by day. The frame grew longer. Soon it stretched like a gleaming corridor of metal and wood, so long that standing at one end made the other fade into mist. The workers began to call it the whale, for its vast curved body resembled a giant rising from the sea. Others called it the skeleton of the sky, for it seemed to belong not to earth but to the heavens above. The rain continued, steady and faithful, washing the workshops, softening the nights. Inside, lanterns burned late into evening, their golden light flickering across the ribs of the airship. The workers' shadows stretched across the walls, thin and bent, as though they too were part of the skeleton, and slowly a kind of reverence grew. Even those who had doubted found themselves pausing to look at what they were building. Even the most skeptical began to wonder. Perhaps, just perhaps, this dream might truly lift itself into the sky. Ferdinand knew there was still much to do. The skeleton was only the beginning. It would need lungs, vast gas cells to give it breath. It would need a skin stretched tight across its frame to keep the air within. It would need engines, steady and strong, to guide it against the will of the wind. But for now, he allowed himself to feel a quiet joy, because the impossible was no longer only lines on paper. It was there before his eyes, solid and shining, rising against the rain. At night, when the workers had gone and silence filled the great workshop, Ferdinand often stayed behind. He would light a single lantern and walk the length of the skeleton, the glow casting long shadows across the girders. The air smelled of oil and damp metal. His footsteps echoed softly. Sometimes he would stop in the very center of the frame, place his hand on the ribs, and look upward through the empty lattice to the ceiling above. In his mind's eye, the skeleton filled with lightness, with breath, with life. He imagined it straining upward, eager to break free of earth. And in that moment, surrounded by rain and silence, Ferdinand would smile, for he knew the dream was no longer his alone. It belonged to the future. The rain outside had turned to a soft drizzle, no longer insistent, but steady like the quiet tapping of fingertips on a drum. It was the sound of patience, the sound of waiting. And indeed, everyone who had labored for years was waiting for this moment. The skeleton of the Zeppelin stood completed, ribs arched, body stretched, silent but magnificent. For months it had lingered as a hollow frame, a body without a soul. Now, at last, it was time to give it breath. Hydrogen, the lightest of gases, invisible, restless, and dangerous. It was the only substance known that could lift such a giant into the sky. But it was also feared, quick to burn, eager to escape, impossible to tame completely. For weeks, debates had echoed among the workers. Some whispered that filling the airship was madness, that it would burst into flame before it ever rose. Others insisted it was the only way forward. Ferdinand listened, steady as always, his eyes calm. He knew the risks. He had felt their weight. Many sleepless nights, staring at the rain sliding down the windows. But he also knew that without courage, dreams remained only shadows. And so, with a nod of final approval, he gave the order. The workers moved carefully, their hands steady, their voices hushed as though they were tending to something sacred. Large tubes and hoses were uncoiled like serpents, their ends fixed carefully to the waiting gas cells. Vast envelopes of varnished fabric, stitched with precision, folded now within the skeleton's ribs. One by one, the valves were opened, and then slowly, invisibly, the giant began to breathe. At first, there was nothing to see. The fabric trembled faintly, lifting, stretching, pressing outward against its seams. The men leaned closer, watching for leaks, listening for hisses. The rain outside tapped its rhythm, as though keeping time. Minutes turned into hours. The gas cells swelled like lungs, filling with air, their long shapes pressing against the lattice of the frame. Where once the skeleton had been hollow, now it began to grow round, full, alive. The wail of the sky was no longer bones. It was becoming a body. Children gathered outside the sheds, their eyes wide as they saw the Zeppelin's shape take form. To them it looked like magic, the way something so fragile, so empty, could swell and stretch, as though it were waking from sleep. Women carried baskets of bread and soup to the workers, their voices soft, their faces pale with both fear and wonder. Inside, the men moved with caution. Every lantern flame was shielded, every spark forbidden. They whispered to one another, their boots muffled on the planks, for even sound seemed dangerous in this fragile moment. And yet, despite the tension, there was awe in their eyes. They knew they were standing within history. Ferdinand himself stood apart, his hands clasped behind his back, his face lit only by the lantern glow. He watched the Zeppelin's body swell, inch by inch, his heart rising with it. Each breath of hydrogen felt like a heartbeat. Each swelling curve felt like a promise kept. Hours passed. The drizzle outside deepened again into rain, steady and loyal, a hymn to the night. Inside, the great gas cells were nearly full. The Zeppelin's skin, once loose and sagging, was now taut, smooth, and gleaming in the lantern light. It no longer looked like a skeleton. It no longer looked unfinished. It looked ready, and yet there was silence. A hush so deep it seemed to swallow the rain. The workers lowered their tools, their breaths caught. They could not quite believe what stood before them. The Zeppelin had taken its first breath. It loomed, vast and magnificent, its body long and silver, its frame swelling with invisible strength. It seemed alive now, though it did not yet move. Alive, yet patient, like a giant whale resting in deep water, gathering power before its first swim. For Ferdinand, the sight was overwhelming. He had imagined this moment for decades through childhood, through wars, through doubt, through candlelit sketches and endless rejection. And now, here it was, towering before him, its breath mingling with the rain and the silence. His heart ached with gratitude. He placed his hand against the cool fabric of the outer skin, feeling the faint tremor of the gas within. It was like laying a hand upon the chest of a sleeping giant, feeling the rise and fall of its breath, and he whispered softly, so only the rain could hear, "You are alive now. Soon you will fly." The rain outside deepened, as though in answer, carrying the whisper away into the night. The rain outside softened into mist, fine and silvery, as though even the sky wished not to disturb the fragile moment that had come at last. The Zeppelin stood ready, no longer only a skeleton, no longer only sketches or whispers in candlelight, was now a giant, full of breath, gleaming pale against the gray morning. It seemed too large to belong to the world of men, too delicate to move, and yet it waited, patient and still, like a creature poised on the edge of awakening. Crowds had gathered along the lakeshore. Men, women, and children huddled beneath umbrellas, their eyes wide, their voices hushed. Farmers had walked miles from their villages. Fishermen left their nets behind. Some came out of curiosity, some from doubt, others from reverence. But all stood united in the quiet rain, staring at the impossible sight before them. The workers moved slowly, their boots dark with mud, their hands steady. Ropes were checked and tightened. Engines, small and clumsy by modern eyes, were fitted into their places, humming faintly with promise. Propellers were tested, their blades slicing the damp air with low whirs. Every detail was touched, tested, whispered over. For today would not allow mistakes. And then, at last, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin appeared. He walked with calm steps, his coat heavy with rain, his face lined not only with years, but with decades of waiting. The crowd parted in silence as he passed. His eyes were fixed only on the ship he had carried in his heart since boyhood. He placed one hand on the gondola, the cabin beneath the airship's belly, and for a moment he simply breathed. The crowd held its breath. The Zeppelin itself seemed to lean into his touch, as if listening, and then quietly, firmly, he gave the command. The ropes were loosened. The engines stirred, coughing into life. For one aching moment, it seemed uncertain, caught between the pull of the earth and the call of the sky. And then, with a grace so soft it seemed like a sigh, it rose. Gasps broke from the crowd. Hats were lifted, hands clutched at chests. Children cried out in awe. The Zeppelin, vast and silver, lifted free of the earth. Slowly, steadily, it rose higher, its long body gliding above the lake. It did not lurch like a balloon. It did not drift helplessly. It moved with purpose, guided by its engines, steady as a ship at sea. The rain blurred, as though the heavens themselves were weeping for joy from below. The crowd watched in silence, their doubts dissolving into wonder. Farmers who had once laughed now stood with tears in their eyes. Children waved, their small hands reaching upward. Fishermen on the lake dropped their oars, their mouths open as the great ship of the sky drifted above them inside the gondola. Ferdinand stood tall. His hands gripped the railing, his eyes fixed not on the crowd below, but on the horizon ahead. For the first time in his life, he was no longer dreaming of flight. He was in it. He was living it. The earth shrank beneath him. The airship hummed around him. The sky opened before him. He did not shout. He did not weep. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment and simply listened. The soft hum of engines, the whisper of wind against fabric, the heartbeat of the Zeppelin itself. It was everything he had imagined, and more. The flight lasted only minutes. The Zeppelin circled slowly, its great body gleaming like a silver lantern in the mist. It turned, steady and deliberate, proving to the world that it was not a drifting toy, but a vessel, true ship of the sky. And then, as carefully as it had risen, it descended once more, the ropes catching, the workers guiding it gently back to earth. When its body settled, there was silence, a deep, stunned silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, slowly, it broke. Applause erupted, wild and unstoppable. Voices rose, cheering, crying, calling. Some shouted Ferdinand's name. Others simply wept, their tears mixing with the rain. And Ferdinand, stepping down from the gondola, lifted his face to the sky. The rain slid across his cheeks like blessings. He only whispered, softly enough that only he could hear. "You have flown. At last, you have flown." The Zeppelin rested behind him, vast and silent. Once more, but the world had changed. The impossible had risen into the sky, and nothing would ever be the same again. The rain outside the present moment deepened once more, steady and soft, like the applause of the heavens themselves. The rain had slowed by evening, slipping into a fine mist that clung to the cobblestones and rooftops of Friedrichshafen. Lamps glowed warmly in windows, their light bending through the fog, while in the air above, the memory of the Zeppelin's first flight still lingered like a dream too real to forget. Crowds lingered long after the great ship had returned to earth. Some walked home in silence, each step slow, as though afraid to break the spell. Others spoke in hurried tones, their voices trembling with wonder. Children clutched their parents' hands and asked, again and again, "Will it fly tomorrow? Will it go higher? Will it cross the world?" But there were doubters still. Beneath the umbrellas and in the shadows of taverns, Some muttered that the flight had been too short, too careful, that the Zeppelin could not survive the true winds of the sky, that it was dangerous, foolish, and doomed to fail. Such voices were not loud, but they were sharp, and they spread like sparks carried on the breeze. Ferdinand heard them, of course. He always had. Doubt had followed him since the very beginning, clinging to his every step, but now, as he sat in the quiet of his study that night, listening to the rain tick softly against the windows, he found he was not shaken, for he had felt it, the rise of the ship, the whisper of the air, the weight of a dream lifted free from the earth. Doubt could not unmake what had been seen. News spread quickly. By morning, newspapers carried the story. Headlines whispered of a miracle. Count Zeppelin's flying ship takes to the skies. Sketches of the vast silver body appeared on front pages, though none could capture its true presence. In Berlin, in Munich, in Paris, in London, eyes widened at the reports, and voices argued in coffee houses and lecture halls. It will never replace ships or trains. A wonder, others said. The future belongs to the skies. Letters poured in, some offering funds, some offering scorn. Children wrote clumsy notes in pencil, telling Ferdinand that they too wished to fly someday. Scientists asked for details. Governments asked for meetings. The Zeppelin was no longer just his dream. It had become the world's question. In the villages nearby, the first flight became a story told around firesides. Old men shook their heads and muttered that they had lived too long, that they had seen what should never have been possible. Young boys carved crude airships from wood and string, launching them into the wind as their mothers laughed. Girls stood at windows, staring at the sky with quiet hope, and yet, in the stillness of night, when the lamps were dimmed and the world seemed to breathe more slowly, a different truth could be felt. It was not only about engines or hydrogen, not only about steel and fabric. It was about courage, the courage to dream beyond laughter, beyond doubt, beyond the heavy weight of impossibility. The Zeppelin had risen, and though it had touched the earth again, the sky no longer seemed so far away. Ferdinand knew the road ahead would be difficult. Money would vanish. Critics would return. Accidents might come. Yet, even with all this, he felt no fear. For he had seen with his own eyes the moment when the earth released its hold and the sky opened. Outside his study window, the rain carried on, steady and patient. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and listened to it. Each drop against the glass felt like a heartbeat, each patter like a promise. The dream had flown, and nothing, not storms, not doubt, not time itself, could erase that. Beyond the lake, the Zeppelin rested quietly in its shed, vast and silent once more. But within its frame, within its breath of hydrogen and its taut skin, it seemed to wait, as if it knew this was only the beginning. And the whispers of the world carried on, some in awe, some in fear, some in doubt, but all of them spoke of one thing: the ship that had risen, the dream that had taken flight. The rain had passed. By dawn, the lake was still, its surface like glass, broken only by the ripples of swans drifting in silence. Mist curled above the water, pale and soft, as though the world itself wished to dream a little longer. On the far shore, the Zeppelin rested in its shed, enormous, quiet, asleep once more after its first awakening. Ferdinand stood alone on the hill above the town, gazing at the horizon, where the sky brightened faintly with morning light. His coat fluttered in the cool air, his boots dark with dew. He was older now, his shoulders bent by years of struggle, but in his eyes was a fire that no storm could quench. For he had seen his dream rise, if only for minutes, and those minutes had stretched across eternity. The world had changed. Perhaps the change was quiet, invisible, a seed planted in the soil of imagination, but it was there. Children across Europe sketched flying ships in their schoolbooks. Engineers debated furiously, drawing new diagrams by lamplight. Newspapers argued, artists painted, poets whispered of the wail of the sky. Even those who doubted could not erase the sight they had witnessed, a ship, vast and impossible, lifting free of the earth. And Ferdinand knew dreams, once seen, could not be unseen. But dreams are not gentle. They demand sacrifice. The years ahead would prove hard. The Zeppelin would face storms, accidents, even fire. There would be setbacks so sharp they cut into the soul. Ferdinand himself would know ridicule, loss, and nights of despair. But he would not let go, because the sky had answered him once, and that was enough. In quiet moments, he thought of his youth, of the boy standing in a field, watching the sky as balloons drifted overhead, wondering if something greater was possible. He thought of the soldier, hardened by war, staring at maps and clouds, wishing for a ship that could carry peace above the battlefield. And he thought of the man, weary and gray, laughed at in salons, dismissed in government halls, who had nevertheless kept sketching by candlelight, his hands trembling but steady. It had all led here, to this, a ship that breathed, a dream that flew. Generations later, people would look back and speak of the Zeppelin with wonder. They would marvel at its grace, its tragedy, its daring. They would call it a relic, a symbol, a story of both triumph and fragility. But for Ferdinand, it was simpler. It was proof that the human spirit could stretch beyond its cage, could rise on wings of fabric and faith, could step into the sky even when the world whispered impossible. As he walked down the hill, the village still sleeping below him, the rain-washed earth soft beneath his boots, he felt no triumph, no pride, only peace. He had given his life to a vision, and that vision had taken flight. Whether it lasted for centuries or only for a breath, it had existed. And that was enough. The Zeppelin rested, still, its skin glistening faintly in the dawn. To some it looked fragile, to others terrifying, but to Ferdinand it was alive. A creature born from courage, carrying not just him, but all of humanity. A little closer to the stars, the mist thinned, the sky brightened. The world moved forward, as it always does. But somewhere, in that quiet dawn, there lingered a truth as soft as rain, that the greatest journeys do not begin with certainty, but with wonder. And in the soft rhythm of the rain's memory, in the echo of that first trembling flight, one could still hear it's the heartbeat of a dream rising gently into the sky.